cooperation for sustainable infrastructure finance and delivery is on our agenda. You might guess why did we need to organize a seminar in this time of holidays and investments never stops. She has been involved into a lot of discussions of the think tanks group recently, so this will be substantial. Enrico Giovannini, former Minister of Sustainable Infrastructure and Mobility of Italy, has joined us as well. And then we will enter, I will get back to that, into the substance of our discussion. With no further ado, I would like to invite President Francesco Profumo to officially open this seminar. Thank you. Please, President Profumo.
Then, first of all, thank you, Nicolas. I think you are almost Italian.
Almost Italian.
Yeah, you liked so much Italy, and thank you for what you did the last year and what you are doing now for the G20 and the D20. First of all, I want to say thank you to the colleagues, to the distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen. And really, it's a great honor to invite you to welcome today for this G20 seminar that is dedicated to unlocking the power of multilateral cooperation for sustainable infrastructure financing and delivery. First of all, let me thank the Circolo dei Lettori. This is a very special institution in Torino where was almost nothing maybe 20 years ago, and now is one of the best points where to meet people, where to have just the possibility to read or to accept a new book. Then it's something really special. Then maybe we have the possibility also to transfer in other places, not only in this area, but also in Italy. And then I would like also to express my heartfelt thanks to the Indonesian Ministry of Finance and the G20 Secretariat, together with the T20, the B20, and the D20 long-term investors for their contribution as a co-organizer of today's event. I'm glad to see such a wide range of stakeholders ready to debate and exchange views on such a crucial topic as infrastructure financing and delivery. Looking back, the past 2 years have been marked with the increasing challenges in the midst of the geopolitical and energy crisis, and with a new economic reception on the horizon. Investing in infrastructure has become a geopolitical lever and an important enabler to unlocking value and fostering long-term economic growth. However, infrastructure investments often must respond to multiple and combined economic, social, and environmental needs, balancing investments that stimulate job creation, productivity, and competitiveness with those that enhance environmental sustainability, resiliency, and urban and social inclusivity can be a difficult task. In order to bridge the financing gap for sustainable infrastructure investments, a stronger multilateral cooperation framework is necessary. Now, more than ever, we need deep and structural reforms on the way infrastructure is financed, built, and managed. To meet economic, social, and environmental expectations, governments, multilateral and national development banks, long-term investors, and the private sector must put sustainability at the heart of their efforts. Given the complex nature of infrastructure investments, it's crucial to find effective tools for allocating and sharing risks between the public and private sectors. Implement de-risking mechanism, and supporting the development of innovative financial instruments are necessary conditions for tapping alternative sources of financing. Sound policies, effective institutions, transparency, and reliable contracts are the key factors in bringing stability to infrastructure markets. Aside from the need to formulate the right regulations and policy to accelerate the transition towards carbon neutrality, infrastructure planners will need to invest in developing infrastructures that promote the use of renewable energy, focus much more on leveraging innovative technology, data and analytics, as well as on the harmonization of metrics and standards, including the development of impact measurements. Alongside effective global public investments, all this can be achieved through high-level dialogue and cross-sectorial and multi-level cooperation. Now, the time is ripe to build on the work done so far and strengthen our cooperation even further during the coming months and years. In support of these complex challenges, today, I would like to propose to all of you the idea of an infrastructure observatory, an observatory that can improve the understanding of the infrastructure sector, intercept new trends at the national and international level, and contribute to create an holistic framework aligning goals, objectives, and standards. An observatory that can promote a closer dialogue and exchange among a network of key players at the local, national, and international levels to increase trust and ensure a better coordination. Finally, an observatory that can advance the agenda on infrastructure through a new generation of development policies focused on overcoming the current challenges and promoting quality and sustainable infrastructure. In my capacity as the lead co-chair of the T20 Task Force Italy, and as the co-chair of the T20 Task Force Indonesia on infrastructure financing and investment, I see this event as a unique opportunity to discuss about the key milestones achieved and share concrete ideas about the future of infrastructure financing and sustainability. I look forward to a constructive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, President Profumo, for these opening remarks and for immediately setting the bar
about the future
high for
of infrastructure
we need to
financing
achieve in
and sustainability. I look forward to a fruitful and constructive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, President Profumo, for these opening remarks and for immediately setting the bar quite high for what we need to achieve in the next 2 days. With no further ado, I would like to invite Michela Favaro, Deputy Mayor of Torino, to join us and also share a few opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, welcome in Turin. I am very honored to host in Turin so many important guests and authorities, and a special thanks to Compagnia di San Paolo for having organized this important seminar, which confirm the strong international vocation of our city. Our city is the seat of many important international institutions. We have the training center campus of the ILO of the United Nations and the European Training Foundation and the our university and our Politecnico, they strengthen the international vocation of our city. The cities are now facing new challenges. We are experiencing increasing inequalities between our citizens, not only in the economic field, but also in the culture and in the education field. So I think that the topic you will discuss are crucial to find a new way, innovative way to reduce these inequalities, to have a sustainable development for our city and for our country. I also hope that you will enjoy staying in Turin, that you will appreciate our important culture and historic heritage. As Mr. Profumo was saying, we are here in one of the most beautiful palaces and the cultural institution of our city. And I look forward to know the result of your discussion. I wish you to have a fruitful discussion during the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now let's hear Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati's address. I think it is uploaded. Please.
His Excellency, Mr. Enrico Giovannini, former Minister of Infrastructure.
I don't think this is the right.
Mr. Francesco Profumo.
This is not the right address.
Fondazione Campania and co-chair of T20 Infrastructure Task Force. Mr. Alberto Cirio, President of Piedmont Region. Michaela Favaro, Deputy Mayor, City of Turin. Prominent speakers, distinguished participants.
His Excellency, Mr. Francesco Profumo, President Fondazione Campania in Sao Paulo, co-chair T20 Infrastructure Task Force. His Excellency, Mr. Alberto Cirio, President of Piedmont Region. His Excellency, Mr. Enrico Giovanni, former Minister of Infrastructure of Italy. Mr. Michela Favora, Deputy Mayor, City of Turin. Prominent speaker, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all of you. First, I would like to express my apologies for not joining this seminar in person. It is my honor to share some messages for the third seminar on sustainable infrastructure finance with the title Unlocking the Power of Multilateral Cooperation for Sustainable Infrastructure Financing and Delivery. Let me also thank His Excellency Francesco Profumo, the President Fondazione Campania, for inviting me to this valuable event and for their consistent contribution towards sustainable infrastructure financing. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, as we are all witnessing, the global economic situation is getting more challenging. Supply disruption due to pandemic, combined with compound risk from the war in Ukraine, as well as many implications of the policy, has causing skyrocketing commodity prices, and this led to a high inflationary pressure. With the increasing inflation that led to the faster than anticipated global monetary tightening, with many advanced and emerging economies raising their interest rate significantly. Given tightening global monetary policy and liquidity condition, emerging countries will need to be increasingly vigilant to the vulnerability from capital outflow, as well as increasing in the cost of funding. The combination of war, surging commodity prices and inflation, and also increasing interest rate will increase the pressure in the form of debt in low income as well as middle income countries, even also in advanced countries. We must understand that even before the current crisis, many countries have already been in a high debt position due to various extraordinary measures that they have to take to shield their economies from the COVID-19 pandemic shock. Looking at those various reasons, the global situation in 2022 is challenging and will continue to be so in 2023. We should not dismiss the possibility of increased risk of recession or even stagflation, which can lead to weakening global economy and certainly is going to create a much challenging environment for all policymakers. Despite this challenging environment, Indonesia economic performance is still growing strongly. Our second quarter performance is actually showing a strong recovery of 5.4% with modest inflation. The external sector performance is also very positive, supporting by strong FDI as well as trade balance, which continue to be in a surplus position for more than 15 months. The robust recovery has brought down unemployment rate from 6.49% in August 2021 to 5.83% this February 2022. We also witnessing declining poverty rate from 10.14% in September 2021 to 9.54% in March 2022. From the budget point of view, our fiscal position remained in a strong and even surplus until end of September. The surplus was a little bit decreased, but this is a very strong turnaround of our budget position comparing to last year. With a strong budget performance this year, the deficit of our fiscal is expected to be much lower, that is 3.9% or lower of GDP. We are now managing a smooth and safe transition toward fiscal consolidation in 2023, in which the deficit will be designed below 3% of GDP. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, today, while challenging global economic situation and geopolitical tension are dominating our agenda of recovery, we cannot overlook the climate change crisis, as it also has significant far-reaching socio-economic impact. In addressing this issue, sustainable financing plays an important role to lead the transition toward a green, resilient, and inclusive economic recovery. Given the current low proportion of green and sustainable financing, there is an urgent need to develop a high-level framework for transition finance to help the financial market being able to support a just and affordable transition to the global economy that can also reaching or achieving sustainability. This is also including how we are going to be able to achieve the Paris Agreement and 2030 Sustainable Development Goal. The framework will develop a common understanding on the key element, how to support financing, especially in facilitating the climate transition. The identification of transition activity will be based on credible technical pathway for major carbon-intensive sector to decarbonize toward net zero. The transition finance framework and implementation of financial institution commitment will certainly benefiting firm as well as corporation and sector to get the financing so that they are able to design the transition and prevent the possibility of stranded asset. We also have to taking care of the possible increasing unemployment or labor implication of this transition. We also have to consider very seriously supply shortages or other effects of disorderly transition. Energy transition is vital for low carbon economic growth that will require a huge investment and transformational policy. For many developing countries that have limited resources and capacity, this is going to be a very hard challenge to overcome. Climate change is important, but they are in a position of capacity which is limited to be able to meet their target of reducing CO2. In this transition toward low carbon economy, we certainly need effort to accelerate decarbonization and simultaneously with the development of the alternative renewable energy such as Energy Transition Mechanism Program, in which Indonesia is currently working with the ADBs as well as many partners. The establishment of the Energy Transition Mechanism or ETM country platform, which we Indonesia promoted during the Finance Minister and Central Bank Governor G20 meeting last July, facilitate together recover stronger. Sustainable infrastructure financing can enhance productivity. It can also increase resiliency and ensure sustainable as well as inclusive growth. We have seen infrastructure that can play a very transformational role that can change the life of citizen and economy. But unfortunately, we have also seen a persistent infrastructure financing gap. For example, in 2017, the Global Infrastructure Hub estimated there could be a gap in the magnitude of 15 trillion US dollar in the form of unmet infrastructure needs cumulatively by 2040. This huge gap will be significantly higher once we also taking into account further investment needed at the speed and scale to meet climate as well as SDG goals. For many developing countries, which have fewer resources to finance sustainable infrastructure, this definitely will create a devastating impact when they cannot meet the target and they are the most vulnerable to be affected by the climate disaster. In 2021 study, which is showing that in order to achieve clean energy investment, we can improve the global GDP by 4% higher in 2030. In contrast, if we are losing, then the GDP, losing the opportunity to create a sustainable infrastructure, the world is going to suffer by 10% of GDP by mid of the century. For developing countries, the losses could be even higher, as big as 25% of their GDP. So understanding that this is going to be fundamental and significant consequences, we have to discuss as well as to find how we are able to scaling up investment in sustainable and how to improve the quality infrastructure, which is going to be critical for generating long-term social, economic, and environmental benefit for the whole country and society globally. In this case, emerging market and developing economy will need and continue demanding a sustainable and quality infrastructure that is going to be a very critical requirement for them to continue making economic progress as well as social progress. These are also the requirement for many developing and emerging countries to achieve their sustainable development goals and their commitment toward Paris Climate Accord. So, If the financing is going to be very, very challenging, in which we estimated that 3 times the current level of investment is going to be needed only for building clean energy. 70% of spending needed in emerging and developing economy, which is close to 40 trillion US dollar for the sustainable infrastructure investment until 2030, certainly is a very huge and significant financing challenge that can be fulfilled by all emerging and developing countries. With the current situation, this is going to be even more challenging. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, under the Indonesia G20 presidency, the Sustainable Finance Working Group, or SFWG, provide a high-level guidance that can be applied across alignment approaches to support a just and affordable climate transition. This includes, first, how to develop a framework for transition finance and improving the credibility of financial institution commitments. Second, how we can scaling up sustainable finance instrument, which the focus on accessibility and affordability. And the third one is how we can discuss policy lever that can incentivize financing and investment toward transition activity. Under Indonesia G20 presidency, the Infrastructure Working Group, or IWG, we also undertake a stock take on leveraging the private sector role to accelerate investment in quality sustainable infrastructure. This also includes how we can scale up sustainable infrastructure investment by leveraging private sector participation. We also discuss how we could enhance social inclusion and addressing subnational disparity. Increasing digital and infratech investment, as well as advancing transformative infrastructure post-COVID-19 are also discussed. Renewing the governance of the global infrastructure hub and advancing the quality infrastructure investment indicator are being also adopted. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, under Indonesia presidency in the G20, climate change definitely has become one of the most important topics, which is not only being discussed, but we also elaborate in the form of high-level guidance across alignment approach in order for us to be able to provide a just and affordable transition of the global economy toward sustainability. Of course, a successful transition will require cooperation and collaboration between government and all stakeholders, including one of the most important role is actually by multilateral institutions. They are in a better position and have the capacity in the form of financing, knowledge, and convening power to mobilize financing and to help technical policy in developing sustainable finance. Following the third seminar of Unlocking the Power of Multilateral Cooperation for Sustainable Infrastructure Financing and Delivery, I would like to encourage all participants to provide tangible outcomes in enriching a smooth green transition framework. This is important not only for us today, but most importantly, it will be important for our next generation. Thank you and have a very productive meeting.
Thank you, Minister Mulyani. I know we have colleagues that are following us online from Indonesia. I should have started by mentioning that this meeting here in Torino is hybrid. and that we have tried also to accommodate time differences. Thank you again, Minister Muliani, and special thanks to the team, with especially Nella Andrietti, who has made this very, very important and very substantial address possible. Please, now I am addressing Minister Enrico Giovannini, former Minister of Sustainable Infrastructure and Mobility of Italy, to close this initial round of opening addresses. Minister Giovannini, please. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important meeting, although I stepped down as minister just a couple of weeks ago. But I'm very glad to be here on the concept of sustainable infrastructures. And I'm underlining this because as soon as I was nominated 20 months ago, I decided to change the name of the ministry from Ministry for Infrastructures and Transports into Sustainable Infrastructures and Mobility. We have to see whether this will survive with the new government. Also other names like ecological transition and digital transition didn't survive. So we'll know, I hope, in a few days. But I'm just underlining this point because I was so impressed by the work done by G20 years ago that I immediately tried to implement this concept in the way in which the ministry had worked. And we developed, I would say, a fully fledged framework in order to make this definition feasible and real in terms of decision-making processes. You may recollect the 6 points of the G20 Sustainable Infrastructures definition, in particular infrastructures that have to be evaluated from a wider perspective, not only the economic impact, but also social and environmental impact, the necessity to evaluate the impact of the infrastructure over the whole life course of the infrastructure, which means also the application of circular economy principles, the involvement of civil society and local communities in order to make decisions, and so on and so forth. We try to address all these points through the development of 3 main instruments. First, for ex-ante evaluation of any new investments, we issued the so-called guidelines for railways investment, road investment, and so on and so forth, also with the help of the European Investment Bank, identifying the parameters, the indicators that have to be used in order to present the project for finance, to be financed by the national government. Therefore, from now on, if regions, if public companies, railways companies want to have their projects financed, they have to present this kind of report with all these indicators. Also for the infrastructures and other projects which are financed by the EU Recovery and Resilience Facility, there is an obligation to prepare a sustainability report with all the evaluation of all impacts, not only economic, but also environmental and social, especially in terms of reduction of inequalities. Just to give you an idea, with the 61 billion euros of our share of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, I'm still saying our, sorry, for the ministry's share, I still have to learn the new language. For the ministry's share, which is the largest share among Italian ministries, the 70% of investments financed through the European funds are classified as contributors to the fight against climate change. The 30% is not because they are against, simply we were not able to compute these kind of indicators according to the EU rules. And just for railways investments, the Gini coefficient of inequalities in terms of access to the railways network is cut by 39%, especially because the investment goes towards the southern regions. So we try to demonstrate that those principles, the G20 principles, could be translated in clear guidelines. But this was only the first step, because as a second step, we developed a scoring system which allows to combine economic, environmental, and social impact assessments into a single indicator in order to have an overall score of that particular investment in order to compare that investment with alternative solutions. In terms of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, we tested the proposed investments against the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda. In some cases, we were able to evaluate from a quantitative point of view, the impact in terms of value added, in terms of reduction of CO2 emissions, in terms of employment, and so on and so forth. In other cases, we were able only to do a sort of qualitative evaluation. Anyway, we tried to demonstrate that also vis-à-vis the SDGs, that approach is feasible. But this kind of approach has been then followed also in the planning system. During these 20 months, which is quite extraordinary for Italy, which is not famous for its capacity of planning the future, we developed strategic planning for railways, for roads and highways, for ports, for road security, and so on and so forth. And in all these cases, we try to look at the G20 principles as a guiding principles. One word about the engagement of civil society and especially local communities. Again, the public debate is a common practice in several OECD countries, not in Italy, on the contrary. This is why the previous government had also almost cancelled this tool, because that was seen just as a waste of time. We changed the rules, we learned from France and other countries, we clarified the timing, the procedural elements, steps, and I have to say that for 11 big investments, the public debates have already been closed, with thousands of citizens who participated in online in-person meetings, and they provided also recommendations that then were used by the companies who have to run the project in order to improve them. So this is not to say that we fixed everything, but I think that what we have done also with the help of OECD experts, one of them was seconded to the ministry, and he was working exactly on this topic at the OECD. I hope that Italy has made a big jump ahead that could eventually be useful for other countries, especially now that infrastructure investments are top on the agenda of almost all countries in the world. Let me just conclude with two words. One about cities, and in particular, urban regeneration. This is one of my regrets. The proposal to finally approve a new law on urban regeneration was not passed because of the government crisis, but I think that the cities will be the field in which either we will win the sustainability war, or we will fail. In Italy, most of the cities, let's say the modern cities, were built after the Second World War in a very disordered way and not really in a way that is sustainable. And we see the results of this also in terms of social problems and so on. This is why we developed a couple of studies, one on decarbonization cities. We have 9 cities in Italy which have been selected by the European Commission as part of the 100 countries that decided to anticipate, and Turin is one of them, to anticipate by 2030 the decarbonization is a huge challenge. And we tried also to develop urban agenda using all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, looking at the different dimensions of the city policies. But the second point is in terms of, that I want, and I will conclude at this point, with the point of resilience. Before joining the government, I helped the European Commission to develop a framework on resilience. So I burned the heavy responsibility of obliging everybody in Italy to say PNRR, so second R. But resilience is a buzzword indeed, but can and must be really a driver of all new investments. How to do that? Well, we sign contracts with a big railway company and other companies, obliging them to invest on the resilience of existing infrastructures. Because the issue of adaptation to climate change is as important as the mitigation. And for countries, and we did that study in 2009 at the OECD when I was chief statistician there, we know that most of the developed countries are going to face huge problems because we built our infrastructure 70 years ago. And now most of them are close to the end of their life. Therefore, unless we invest deeply and largely on keeping the existing infrastructures and to make them resilient to climate change, we will face huge problems. So as you see, resilience, sustainability, and cities, in particular urban regenerations, are the 3 keywords that I try to convey, and maybe the experience made by Italy can be helpful also to other countries. Thank you very much.
And these elements which you have just summarized could certainly also contribute to nurture the agenda of the observatory that was mentioned by President Profumo. So with this, Minister Giovannini, thank you very much. This closes the round of opening addresses, which were both substantial and rich, and also set the tone for the rest of the discussions this afternoon. So now I would like to open the second moment of this first day of our seminar with the first panel discussion about sustainable finance for infrastructure in light of the G20 Indonesia. We have speakers here with us and we have speakers online. Let me first convene the speakers who have joined us here physically to join me on stage. Carmine Di Noia, Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs at the OECD. Welcome, Mr. Di Noia. Please have a seat. You should have your name on one of the seats. Thank you very much. Giovannini dell'Aricia, welcome here. Thank you. Please join me on stage as well. Yeah, welcome. I think your seat is over here. And last but not least, Robert Mark Scholhammer, Representative, European Representation Office of the Asian Development Bank. Thank you very much. I should have mentioned that Giovannini dell'Aricia is the Deputy Director of the Research Department at the International Monetary Fund. And online has joined us Alessandro Carano, who is in the US, in Boston at this moment, senior advisor for the European Union Recovery Task Force at the European Commission. So I would just like to ask Mr. Di Noia, because we initially envisioned to start with you, I would like to ask if you would agree that we pass the baton to Alessandro Carano, who I think has a major constraint afterwards, but we wanted to definitely hear the perspective from the EU about both infrastructure investments, but also in the context of major programs that were reminded to us minutes ago by Enrico Giovannini. So, Alessandro, the floor is yours. Welcome. We see you. I think we will hear you. And then we will continue with the very important presentation that was prepared by Carmine Di Noia and the colleagues at OECD with all the wealth of experience and inputs within the OECD regarding the different angles of infrastructure investments and sustainable finance, which were already recaptured by the speakers. So with that, Alessandro, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm very pleased to be with you today. And thank you to Compagnia di San Paolo and the G20 presidency for inviting me. I'm actually working in the European Commission Recovery Task Force on secondment from the European Investment Bank, which was mentioned by the former Minister Giovannini. I would like to start picking up on what Minister Srimulyani mentioned at the end of her intervention about the next generation, because actually, as you probably know, the whole program that was launched by the EU 2 years ago, it's called the Next Generation EU. And that's the main focus, because the rationale of this program is to take, let's say, to turn a crisis into an opportunity. So from the moment we had a major economic and social crisis due to COVID, we started to reflect about ways to address this crisis, this shortage of investment and even liquidity and difficulties for many companies, but also transform the European economy to make it more sustainable, especially to boost the green and the digital transition. So this is the rationale of the initiative, which is pretty large. It has a total size of about 840 billion euros between 2020 and 2026. The bulk of this money would be channeled through the so-called recovery and resilience, thanks to former Minister Giovannini, who has resilience in the name, Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is a 724 billion program, which are deployed through the government, through the member states, 27 member states in the EU. Almost half of this amount are grants, subsidies, and a bit more than half are loans available to governments to borrow. So far, we have disbursed already in 2021, in the first part of 2022, 115 billion to member states. And I would like to highlight the three main features of this facility. The first one is that it is performance-based. We have in the EU context very few examples, small examples of let's say, programs based on performance. Most of the instruments and programs are based on actually co-financing on the basis of invoices. But this one is based on performance, which means that we pre-agree the EU and the member states a kind of legal contract which establishes what are in details the milestones and targets which have to be achieved every quarter between the moment the plan was approved and 2026. And every 6 months, the member states can request the payment of a predefined tranche once the milestones and targets are achieved. So the Commission and then ultimately the Council of the EU member states give their approval if the milestones and targets have been achieved. And milestones and targets are related to a wide range of reforms and investments, which again are predefined and negotiated between the EU and the member state. And these reforms and investments cover wide range of areas. In particular, in terms of reforms, we have many examples in the public administration. We have basically structural reforms, which are tailored to the needs and to the gaps of the member states, as assessed by our macroeconomic framework, which is also linked to the SDGs, by the way, the so-called European semester. So some examples of reforms include public administration, justice reform, including in Italy, fiscal reforms, for example, on pensions, decarbonization reforms, and several reforms also to promote investments, for example, on procurement. And then we have the investment side, and so for each plan of member states, we have a synergies between reforms and investments. This is also an important element. And investments range from energy, transport, digital, but also healthcare, education, and environment, etc. The second element I want to highlight is the focus on the green and digital transition. We have specific targets, minimum targets that each member state plan has to fulfill in order to be approved. In particular, at least 40% of the plan in terms of value has to be focused on green measures with a very precise way of tagging each measure and what is very similar to the Rio markers of the OECD. So minimum 40% of the plan, minimum 36% of the plan has to contribute to the green transition. And in actual facts, we are at 40%, so we are well above. And in terms of digital contribution to digital transitions, both infrastructures and skills, minimum 22% of the plan size has to contribute to this. And today we are already above at 26%. The third characteristic that I want to highlight of the Recovery and Resilience Facility is the link with the borrowing. So we have a large program of borrowing by the EU, so issuing essentially EU bonds on the capital markets to raise funds to finance this initiative. And a large part of this borrowing are green bonds. So there is a focus also on the borrowing side on the sustainability and the development of green bonds, on which, by the way, as you probably know, there are definitions being developed under the Sustainable Finance Initiative and the taxonomy, in order, as the Minister Srimulyani mentioned, to give clear signals to the markets of what can be labeled as green bond, but also as green in general, so to increase the confidence of investors. Now, a few words on the status and on the future. So we are on track with all the plans of the member states. 26 have been approved out of 27. We only miss Hungary, and they are all under implementation. So we have now experience and the system works. The administrations and also the EU institutions start to get used to these novelties, because it's a very innovative, large program. And the deployment on the field is satisfactory according to all the stakeholders involved. Some characteristics that I think are useful, because Nicola asked me to highlight some of the features of European models for financing of investments and infrastructure, also building up on experience with the so-called Juncker plan, which is now called InvestEU, which is a very large parallel program financing primarily private sector investments in a bottom-up way, on a demand-driven way, with through financial institutions like the EIB and the Cassa Depositi Prestiti and many national banks. The common characteristics are, first of all, this focus on the sustainability, which is embedded in the regulation. So it's not just a slogan, it's the real, clear, legally binding requirements and targets which are introduced through regulation, and which the borrower or the counterpart has to satisfy. And there is a whole sustainability proofing methodology in the InvestEU, as well as so-called do no significant harm guideline in Recovery and Resilience Facility, that is a very thorough assessment of the sustainability of investments. And these are part of the regulation, so they are legally binding. The second point is the involvement of private sector. Through the governments, through public tender, we have a strong emphasis on public and transparent tendering, which forces also the government calls for tenders to attract private sector and private contractors. and even more in the InvestEU, there is a strong emphasis on private sector co-financing, because all the needs and all the analysis we know from various institutions which are around the table also today show that you cannot achieve the SDGs without involvement of private sector. The third element is the impact, and I encourage all of you to give a look, if you have the chance, to the Recovery and Resilience Facility scoreboard. We have a scoreboard now recently published, which starts to be filled with data, and you can track the impact. We have 14 indicators, for example, energy savings, alternative fuels, recharging points, or number of people trained, or SMEs supported. And all these data are available in a kind of real time, because we update them based on the member states reporting at least twice per year. The other element is the open competition and the fact that we have a strong state aid framework, which also tries to avoid market distortions. And then we have a number of rules which are promoting free procurement and transparent disclosure of data. And finally, there is an emphasis on cohesion and on solidarity between regions and member states. So I will stop it here and ready to come in. I can still stay another 20 minutes if there are possibilities. Otherwise, it was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alessandro. I was thinking, listening to you and this very valuable portrait, right, of investment strategies at the scale of the European Union, that it is nearly 500 million people, right, living in that space. And whereas we are talking about initiatives countries by countries, I was also thinking about the examples that were brought up by Minister Giovannini in the different cities and regions in Italy, but also a project like in Paris, this Grand Paris double loop metro project, 40 billion euros, which looks like it's the French genius who has invented it. It is, of course, always, but it would not be possible without the framework of the EU, also because of the guarantees that need to be brought for issuing green bonds by several billions of euros, etc. So you can see in each and every country in different measures also the positive impacts of having rules and regulations and a common space for investments and discussing regulations. That's very valuable. And when we are talking about, and we will talk about India in a few moments, right? So we are talking about even larger scales in terms of demography, or Indonesia is nearly 300 million people. So, but at that scales, many lessons or many initiatives taken at the level of the EU also call upon the validity of regional approaches, right, to transformations that are being discussed today. We will get back to that probably, Alessandro, in a minute, but with no further ado, with that, I would like to pass it on to Carmine Di Noia, and I think you have prepared a few slides to summarize a number of initiatives that were coordinated by the OECD in the past month and years regarding our topic. So the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you. Yeah, there are just a few slides on my side. Okay, but good afternoon to everyone here and also online. So it's a pleasure to be here today, and thanks for Compagnia San Paolo, but also G20. D20, T20 for this invitation. Now, this conference, as also was mentioned by Minister Sri Mulyani, marks the end of the Indo-Asian G20 presidency and the discussion actually in advance just of the Leader Summit. And so we look forward actually to see also many areas, by the way, the results for this also from our point of view. So this is a timely opportunity, I think, to reflect on the outcomes of the discussion. And so I will devote this brief introduction to overview the recent developments that we had, and also maybe a couple of words also on what we can expect by the Indian presidency, also due to the discussion we're already having with the delegation. So we start by addressing some of these the longer-term infrastructure investment needs, and then turn to an overview of the G20 infrastructure working group outcomes in 2022, which was already also mentioned, and it's where we take an active role. And so with also the focus on our work. And maybe then we can mention something also on the presidency. Now, first, very quickly, okay, and also some numbers have been already mentioned and they float around and everyone can have the different estimates, but we have to consider, I mean, the order of magnitude of the challenges ahead of us. So the world needs both more and better infrastructure. Now, billions of people, lack access to basic infrastructures, such as clean energy, water, healthcare services, and communication, so really the basic stuff. Now, despite broader recognition of this fact, our estimates is that suggest that we still need an extra 2.5 to 3.5 trillion in infrastructure investment each year. And obviously, so here the private sector also need to play a key role in this endeavor. But actually, in recent years, both public and private investment has seen a declining trend, so which affecting in particular social infrastructure. And so, okay, we can see that as a result, the infrastructure investment gap is set to reach actually 15 trillion by 2040, hoping that also the numbers, the first one going down. But actually, this figure could be much, much higher, and these are also the numbers mentioned by Minister Muliani, if sustainable infrastructure needs supporting the transition to net zero, especially in developing and emerging economies, if they are not adequately taken into account. So numbers are really immense. Now, the G20 Infrastructure Working Group has a number of work streams dedicated to addressing these challenges. And so I will focus basically on sustainable infrastructure and also the subnational work of the OECD. Now, sustainable infrastructure is the main work stream of the IWG. And so the OECD inputs include leading the organization of the G20 Infrastructure Investor Dialogue, as well as a report on improving the conditions for and data quality and availability of sustainable infrastructure financing. And this is one thing. The second one, we know at the October G20 Finance Minister meeting, now the G20 OECD Policy Toolkit on mobilizing funding and financing for inclusive and quality infrastructure investment in regions and cities was endorsed, finally. And so we also provided a report on regional disparities in the wake of COVID-19. Now, I mean, the OECD report, the last one I mentioned, which is the Advancing, as the title, and I think many of you may know, Advancing the Environment and Data for Sustainable Infrastructure Financing. It was issued, again, during the G20 Finance Ministers Central Bank Governors meeting in October this year. It has two chapters, basically, that focus on financing, which I will briefly also address and I'll mention in the slide. So the first is on ESG data landscape, and the second is on the legal and regulatory barriers to quality infrastructure investment. Now, and speaking in front of a former chief statistician at the OECD, now data collection for infrastructure, actually data is a long-standing chattel. Data for infrastructure is an old challenge. And so always have been a key point in the discussion at the OECD and all international fora, and notably the G20. And to list very few and basic, issues. So first thing is data sources are fragmented across institutions. There is a lack of commonly agreed definitions. And there are also, in some cases, confidentiality issues, since some of the data, in some cases, are proprietary. So basically, this has led to a lack of visibility on infrastructure investment. And so, as you can imagine, when it comes to ESG data, this is even more. So the ESG data landscape for infrastructure builds on the problems that we have in general, and so these issues becomes even trickier. And so the availability in this case is even more basic and limited. and so adding to the much broader challenge. So first, we need, at least this is what we have always advocated, a better and clearer definition of the basic stuff, so of what infrastructure is. And that's why actually the OECD is proposing the collection of infrastructure capital stock data at the national account level, as well as setting out a definition of infrastructure for data collection purposes, based on the work that actually we have carried out with our working party on national accounts. Second, we also need a more consistent approach for what ESG in infrastructure investment is. And so clearly we are not there yet. So our report includes a mapping of 21 sustainable finance and infrastructure initiatives and identifies their limitations. So particularly in relation to the S, to the social and governance factors. Many lack a risk-based assessment with binary yes or no responses, that being the most common approach. And actually also another thing is that many infrastructure data are heavily skewed towards advanced markets, and so very limited coverage for Africa and Latin America. So data also for ESG approaches to infrastructure are almost non-existent. But international organizations and fora are working on these, including the OECD. One example is the IFC indicators. Another example is the development of certification schemes like the Blue Dot Network that can help to increase the availability and the consistency of data. Let me accelerate, but just are 2 slides. Now, on legal and regulatory barriers, I mean, nothing new. There are institutional weaknesses to processes and administer infrastructure projects. It's interesting they are different in the different regions. At least this is what Europe, basically, this is more expressing, engaging what were the discussions. So key point is what quality infrastructure is. So how to define, measure, and assess it. And this is important for policymakers, but also for project developers and many actors here. So clarifying all these aspects is essential to offer investors more certainty and sustainable infrastructure. More specifically, important, we think we need a proper asset class. So if we are able to invest to really identify, sustainable infrastructure, this can be interesting. If it's an asset class, all the other things being equal, also the cost of capital and cost of investment can be reduced. And okay, just to go to the last slide. I mean, we will hear also later. So based on the discussion we're having with the Indian delegation, basically it seems that 1, defining infrastructure for data purposes, 2, resilience of infrastructure, and 3, urban infrastructure, this was also mentioned at the end of the previous speech, will be the focus area, so for the Indian presidency. These are excellent to develop further, and so on our point, I mean, through our, let's say, international standard setting role and the commitment to multilateralism, I think that we are also well placed to explore synergies and articulate a common approach, between also the different stakeholders, the different infrastructure, regional and global initiatives, and so we look forward to working to support this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I suggest that in this moment, if there are any remarks from the floor, we can take that. We can answer them a bit later, but we are here also in a working environment, right? So if there are any comments, maybe also from Francesco Profumo or from Minister Giovannini about everything which was mentioned so far, please do not hesitate at any moment, right, to intervene. Or Sachin Chaturvedi from ARIS from India, who has successfully managed to join us, or anyone from the panels. And I don't know if we have a way to gather inputs or questions from the audience which is following us online. If you have questions, please use the chat function. It's a Zoom, so you have a chat function. If you have also questions, remarks, do not hesitate to share them. We will try to find a way to address them. And thank you for this portrait of infrastructure investments. And it's fascinating always to see the diversity of contexts and inputs. And I was also thinking about the last slide with the elements which you quoted about the preparation of the G20 India. That in fact is not the G20 India, right? But it has been made clear also on many occasions that it was Indonesia, it will be India chairing the G20, but then afterwards Brazil, and there has been presidential elections in Brazil with expected...
With an accession country to the OECD, by the way. So Brazil has started with other 4 countries also the accession to the OECD. So we'll be interested.
Exactly, and then South Africa, and which at this moment are still not OECD countries, but you were right also to remind about the number of existing pathways of cooperation and issues about well-being, for instance, that were reminded us by Minister Giovannini have also been part of these flows of discussions. But in any case, we can expect that and it was very clear to my mind in the keynote from Minister Muliani, ways to look at a number of macroeconomic issues. They are both common within the G20 space, or they could even be common with a number of G7 kind of inputs, but they are also different in ways to envision transformations. And it's very clear also that from the point of view, for instance, of Indonesia, it is no longer what we have heard in the past. We need more funding coming from the rich countries, etc. It is much more an indigenous pathway of change that is being built out, fully cognizant about a number also of macroeconomic hurdles, but clear also decision that the issue of risk or de-risking of investments and the management of sudden outflows of capital, right, which are linked with macroeconomic circumstances, need to be addressed, and that they cannot just be depending on external frameworks. I think these are changing conditions which are extremely important. And I would like to turn to sorry, Giovannini del Areccia. You are not an infrastructure specialist in our table, but definitely not. But I was deeply impressed when researching about your work. And there was an article which you published, if not mistaken, about rethinking macroeconomic policies back in 2011 or 2012, right? Which has received nearly 3,000 citations since then. And so it has received, in fact, so many citations over the years that presenting your work, they had to create a small graph about the yearly quotation of the citations linked with this article. Just to say that you are a very well-recognized and prominent specialist of macroeconomic policies. I hope you feel comfortable with context is completely opposing any kind of efforts to structure nice standards and etc. So we definitely had to have you around this table to enlighten us a little bit from the IMF standpoint about the current trends and the current assessment of macroeconomic forecasts, short-term, mid-term, longer-term, and that at any point, feel free also to give any comment about what are your impressions from the point of view of assessing, evaluating, managing macroeconomic policies regarding infrastructure priorities. That being said, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for the very flattering introduction. And on that paper, it does help when you co-author with Olivier Blanchard. You know, it's like I cannot take credit for the many citations. I think my next paper has 1/3 of those. So if you want a control experiment, you have it right there. Let me start by first thanking the organizers, the G20, the Compagnia di San Paolo, for their very kind invitation. Second point I want to make, this is because it's an open conference, the views I'm expressing here are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the fund, its board, or its management. And finally, on a personal note, Compagnia di San Paolo funded my PhD over 25 years ago. So thank you. It's a very belated thank you. At the same time, and I want to say there was a program that really almost single-handedly generated an entire generation of Italian economists, and Pietro is one of them. So thank you on behalf of everybody. Now, of course, after my presentation, you may realize that 25 years ago you made a big mistake, but that's that's a risk I'm willing to take. So then I'm going to briefly touch on a medium-term trend in increasing in levels of sovereign debt in emerging markets and low-income countries. And then I'm going to touch on some of the contributions that the fund, which is not really a micro institution, has done to the field of infrastructure spending in terms of technical assistance to countries in particular. So let me start with the forecast. So Russia's war in Ukraine, high commodity prices, and resurging inflation, and the associated tightening of monetary policy in almost all major currency areas has led us to downgrade growth, both for this year and the next. So to give you a parameter, 2021 global growth was 6%. We are looking at 3.2 for 2022 and 2.7 for 2023. And these are, also to give you background, the weakest numbers since 2001, with the exception of the year, basically the COVID year and the GFC year. So these are very weak numbers. And it's very broad-based, so it goes across all regions in the world. We don't really have a major decoupling this time around. At the same time, in the middle chart, you see that inflation has come back. It feels a little bit like the 70s to some extent. And we think it will peak this year at around 9%, 8.8, to moderate in 2023 to 6.5 and 2024, 4.1. I know this is assuming that everything goes as to plan. But one element of the current macro scenario is massively increased uncertainty along many fronts. I mean, one is the war with unpredictable consequences from the point of view. I mean, we just had a stop and go on export of cereal. There could be many others. Another one is, we don't really know the degree of persistence of inflation in many jurisdictions. Because we are coming out of a completely unprecedented type of shock, there is the risk of miscalibrating both the monetary policy stance and the fiscal stance, because we don't really understand yet completely what the COVID shock was. And that's one of the reasons many central banks were behind the curve with inflation. You cannot blame them, nobody saw it. So there is an element of that. And then, of course, there is always the specter of some segment of the financial sector, some dark corner with vulnerabilities that we haven't seen yet. So because of that, you see on the last chart on the right-hand side, the confidence intervals around the forecast are extremely wide, and we cannot exclude, actually we attach about a 10% probability to what we will call a global recession with growth rates below 2%. So let me, after this nice and gloomy scenario, let me give you another gloomy one, which is a medium-term trend over the past about 10 years. Debt to GDP ratios in emerging markets and low-income countries increased by about 20 percentage points. They moved from about 40 to right below 60 in emerging markets, and from 30 to right above 50 in low-income countries. So this is a massive expansion of public debt. And at the same time, because of the monetary policy tightening, because of a change in the global financial cycle with substantial increases in risk premia, the cost of funding for these countries has also increased over the past 2 or 3 years. And this is creating a very challenging environment for funding infrastructure investment. So at the same time, you had debt that is close to sustainability, to the area, the region where that sustainability becomes an issue, and you have increases in funding cost. So how do we go forward from here? Well, we see a couple of elements. One element is, from the donor's point of view, we need to think more about grants and less about loans. I mean, this is easy from our point of view to say. When you talk to the treasuries, it's less easy. But we also had to facilitate a more efficient and more speedy restructuring process for sovereign debt when it's needed. And you know, in many African countries, this has been a challenge in recent years. And finally, you know, this is a little bit of motherhood and apple pie, as we say in the United States. It's a common, you know, common sense approach I'm going to talk about in a second, is that we need to look for efficiencies. So given the budget constraint is what it is, we need to see if we can squeeze resources out of doing things better. And this resonates a little bit, you know, the themes that have been touched on today already. So the fund has done a fair amount of research on efficiency losses in public investment. I didn't want to put specific, I mean, the paper has specific numbers, but I think it's better just to think in broad terms. Our research suggests that on average, across all countries, about 1/3 of spending is wasted, and that improvements in governance could cut the loss in half. So you go from 1/3 to 1/6. On top of that, there is massive heterogeneity in these inefficiencies, and inefficiencies are, as expected, larger in poorer countries, which is good and bad. So it's bad in the sense that they are poor, and on top of that, there are inefficiencies, but also gives you more room for improvement. So that's where the low-hanging fruits are to some extent. Now, in the context, the fund has developed two sets of tools. One I'm going to cover in more detail. It's called PIMA, it's the Public Investment Management Assessment. And the other one is the public-private partnership fiscal risk assessment that is joint with the World Bank. But I'm going to focus just on the first one. So this is a program was developed in 2015. It's a very comprehensive assessment of the infrastructure and governance for public spending. It covers all three phases, so planning, allocation, and implementation. It's demand-driven, so it's the authorities that approach us asking for an assessment. Is run by our Fiscal Affairs Department. I think we've done over 70 of them, you know, those are all the dots, and they've been in all levels. I mean, Ireland was one. It's not just emerging markets and low-income countries, but some advanced economies as well. The fund, you know, this wheel chart on the side gives you a summary of the aggregate results. It's too small for you to read, but let me give you in a nutshell. Essentially, all countries would benefit from improved governance, but there are heterogeneities, as I was saying, and poorer countries would benefit much more. And there is also an element of heterogeneity across the phases of the investment process. And there are many more inefficiencies in the allocation and implementation phases than in the planning one. And this is also consistent with the fact that countries tend to score better in terms of overall design of their macro governance than the design of the governance of public investment specifically. Now, I don't have time to go through country cases, but let me say that there has been an incredibly positive response to these reports, and most countries have actually acted on the basis of the recommendations. For example, Ireland instituted a relatively sophisticated tracking system for public investment that increased transparency, the timing of the realizations, and so on. Now, finally, and this is my final slide before the conclusions. In the research department, we've been active on a more like 30,000 feet level, and we have built models, small models, that can be calibrated at the country level, and that have been updated to include, for example, countries that are heavily reliant on natural resource sectors, and also now they've been used to push our activities in environmental economics and study natural disasters, for example. And these models have elements that can incorporate improvements in efficiency of public spending. And here I'm just putting a simulation as an example for an average low-income country. If you could increase public spending and investment by about 0.5% of GDP, and from our interaction with country authorities. So to conclude, the takeaways, I'm sorry, we are the institution that is paid to rain on the parade. And we are always coming with a little bit of doom and gloom, but this is our job. So we are seeing a relatively weak global environment for growth over the next 2 years, coupled with inflation that at the global level we haven't seen since probably early 80s. A situation that is going to see many countries pushing against the barrier of that sustainability. And this is across the spectrum of different levels of income and development. And is a challenging environment for funding infrastructure spending. So I think when you are against the wall, you need to create as much room as you can, and improving efficiency in spending would probably generate a little bit of the room that we need that is not environment. And I'll stop here.
Not be addressed, right? All the curves which you have shown about growth prospects were rather sluggish, right? Against a backdrop of risks of recession, right? Which are also well described by your institution and others. In the meantime, what Minister Muliani mentioned, and I will try to recapture the essence of what she said regarding potential losses of GDP in a number of countries, especially already lower income countries, should they not be able to address a number of issues, especially related to climate adaptation and mitigation, but also other needs, in particular equipment in terms of digital infrastructure, right? So how could international deliberations help, on the one hand, address the inefficiencies which you have been describing, but also avoid that there is a growing divide between different countries and regions, one which would be more apt to address the challenges you have been describing, and others that might not be that apt in this very moment. And maybe also Carmine Nidoia or Robert Schollhammer, you would like to answer this question, or anyone else here today, if you have any thinking about either macroeconomic policies or coordination, or how the G20 could play a convening role, so precisely how to avoid those discrepancies to be enlarged.
Yeah, well, I obviously I don't have an answer for that. I probably would be much smarter and wealthier if I had that kind of answer. But I think there are 2 points to be made, and one is obvious. One of the challenges of the current time is not only that we face all these problems and shocks, but that the geopolitical environment is one that is pushing toward fragmentation in a massive way. And that is a shock in itself to some extent. It is a problem for the solution of the existing shocks and adds a shock to what we are already facing. So that is where we need to work on. I think the fund is trying, but this, to some extent, is bigger than us. I think maybe the lower hanging fruit is still high, but it's lower. Is helping with debt reprofiling, debt restructuring processes that are, for many countries, very cumbersome, especially on the sovereign side. I think the private sector side, we do a little better, but since the Paris Club has not, Paris Club used to be the only creditor, and that was very easy. Now it's not, and that complicates things enormously. So I think progress on that front would help relaxing some of the constraints that I've just described.
Thank you very much.
Obviously, no answer, no solution. But the only thing is that obviously, the situation and macroeconomic situation is increasingly probably difficult. At the same time, the urgency, what we see of dramatic, the events and climate change makes, despite the difficult situation, I think there is an urgency to intervene. And many of these events, they do happen actually in countries which may face even more, a difficult situation from a macroeconomic point of view. So that's why I think G20, the role, I would say, in the coordination of, big countries, international organization, these can be, and some of the things that are, we have been, working on the topic of, let's say, of data standardization, disclosure of information. This can make other things being equal, maybe cheaper, or giving more incentives to try to really execute what has been really discussed at the international level. So we need to act in any case, and actually the role here of institutions like the fund can be helpful, especially with respect to some countries. So we need to act in any case.
Thank you. So I will pass it on to my neighbor in a second, because you have been hearing a lot about banking, multilateral financial institutions, multilateral development banks, and others. But just before that, it was mentioned a lot about conflicts and fragmentations and geopolitical situation. But looking back in history, and I think President Profumo reminded us that Compagnia di San Paolo, right, was established in 1563, so about 500 years ago. And it was established in a period of time where Europe was recovering from a long war between France on the one hand, and Spain on the other hand, and the Holy German Empire, which was very deadly. And out of that, in 1959, there was a major peace treaty in Cateau-Cambrésis in France, and that completely changed the landscape for international relations throughout Europe for over a century. So, there has been already significant conflicts, but also we can see that institutions were created out of difficult times and situations precisely to address regeneration and renovation of both social and socio-economic ways to look into a number of global affairs. So I think it's not just randomly that we have these discussions here in Torino and hosted by Compagnia di San Paolo. But let's get back to the 21st century and to 2022 and the upcoming decade of the SDGs with you, about your vision precisely of the role of the multilateral development banks and how they can interact with governments, with the private sector players, with others, so as to also take their share of responding to a growing call of governments, help us meet growing needs and address growing finance gaps. Robert, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, and also to our hosts as well, in this rather magnificent setting. I think from the Asian Development Bank, I think I mentioned, Nicholas, we were very happy to be here. Infrastructure is really our bread and butter. The old joke used to be ADB is Asian Dams and Bridges, and it's changed over the years, but even now, if you go to the cafeteria, you bump into a lot of engineers who they really know their railroad density and their gigawatts. So this is very much in our DNA, and it's a very, very relevant conversation for us. So maybe I can speak obviously for the ADB. We're part of the family which looks after Asia, not a small part of the world. It's half the world's population, so quite significant. But I think a lot of the principles hold true for the other development banks. I think back in 2017, we also did a very comprehensive report, Meeting Asia's Infrastructure Needs. It's very good, and basically is a very detailed catalogue of what is needed, not wanted, but needed. And maybe I can just rattle through a few statistics very quickly. It's from 2017 to 2030, $26 trillion worth of infrastructure. That would be $1.7 trillion a year, of which 200 billion is for climate change. Now, COVID will not have helped these numbers at all. So the numbers we will be behind in that. If you disaggregate that, we came up with 14.7 trillion for power, 8.4 trillion for transport, 2.3 trillion for telecoms, and 0.8 trillion for water and sanitation. So basically a lot. Now, in Asia, again, large part of the world, the baseline was $881 billion worth of spending on infrastructure per year. So about half. So that's a colossal financing gap just in this one part of the world. Biggest spenders, you won't be surprised to hear, People's Republic of China, Vietnam, in terms of spending the percentage of their GDP, about 5.5%. At the bottom, some surprising countries, Thailand, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, Mongolia. 90% of the infrastructure is publicly funded, and of which, again, that's influenced very much by the Chinese statistic. Of course, you will see more private sector participation in energy and telecoms, less in water sanitation. These are typical trends. Now, the multilateral development banks together, the family, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, AIIB, EBRD, the whole family together funded a colossal 2.5% of infrastructure in Asia, 2.5%. If you exclude China and India, it's 10%, so it's a bit more. We are minority financiers, and I think unless we get a vast capital increase and the borrowing headroom of our clients in Asia increases, we are going to remain minority financiers, and I think that's something which we took to heart. Now, if you look at the actual needs, and again, it's all in the reports, I'm not going to go into detail, but with the COP in mind, 66% of all power in Asia is generated by coal. So you can imagine the scale of that. Sometimes, I wonder, cycling to work in Frankfurt, is it really worth it if you have so much coal in Asia? I mean, what's the point? So obviously there's a lot to do. Sanitation. 52% of Asians in rural areas have sanitation. Again, the numbers are colossal. So again, this is the work we have to do on a daily basis. How do we get around that? Now, the key principle here is that it has to be for the countries, obviously, for Indonesia, Mongolia, whoever, to decide what do they want. And I think we've heard already before this multiple range of crises with COVID, capital outflow, food security, you name it. How do you get space in that policy? So, and I think the point was made before, infrastructure is complicated. Look at Berlin Airport, 10 years late. These things are difficult, but transpose that into a developing country, it's difficult. So that's about the scale of Asia, a lot to do. Now what does, maybe if you don't mind, a few words about ADB itself. Our job is to support our developing member countries. Italy, thank you very much, as well, has been a member country of ADB since '66. I think it's $2.7 billion invested in ADB. It's not small, and has been a very major donor to us for our fund for the poorer countries. So we really, at the time that I've been with ADB, the leveraging capacity is enormous. So this is why I think the MDBs are very much in the spotlight at the moment for why we should be scaling up. Now, for the next years ahead, we find our clients are really torn in all directions. They want counter-cyclical financing. They also want infrastructure. How do we weave this all together? So now, a few thoughts about going to scale. How do we work with our countries to make that happen? The first thing is help them articulate the needs. When you're confronted with all these challenges, how do you develop your strategy? That's part of our job. Help develop a pipeline. You often probably have heard it's not about the money, it's about the lack of projects. To some extent, that's true. We help with project design. Also regionally, and I think this is where it's very useful to discuss at the G20 or other regional fora, we manage the ASEAN's infrastructure fund. We work to help countries. Don't forget, in Asia, there's no European Union or African Union. So we actually help with a lot of the regional cooperation work, Central Asia, the Mekong. And very importantly, given that we only fund 2.5% of this small little drop in the bucket, it's all about catalyzing. How do we bring in other financiers? So we do a lot of work with governments to help design projects. We're not possessive. If European Investment Bank, which got an $800 million contract recently, so you're going to have a Spanish company in the Philippines on an ADB-funded PPP developing very modern infrastructure. It can happen. I didn't expect it to happen so fast. Now, our biggest input there wasn't the money. It was helping the PPP Center in Manila to design and put through a good project. We actually have a fund there, not with European participation, unfortunately. It's Japan, Australia, and Canada, the Asia Project Preparation Facility, which actually helps countries. Again, it's not about the money. It's design those good projects, which then attract the capital, and which then lead downstream to these huge contracts for Spanish companies. So there's a lot of exciting things happening under the PPP front. Now, what are the challenges ahead? There is money available. The funding architecture is horribly complicated. If I were in a developing member country's situation, I would be confused. Things are bureaucratic, great room for harmonization. As a representative for ADB in Europe, I see that Asia is not on the agenda. It's not a priority agenda, that's very clear. Yet a small amount of money into one of these funds to design good projects in Philippines or Vietnam can really lead to a lot downstream. So I think those are the main points I wanted to mention. Primarily, if you want to make this happen, there are many instruments. The key thing is help countries build up the capacity, help them design good projects, crowd in capital, work together, collaboration, which is what I guess this is all about, and again, put that developing member country of ours in the center. And I think that's our recipe for success. So thank you very much.
Thank you indeed. So we are nearly reached compared with the needs. You also reminded us about the catalytic effect, and that leads to bigger figures. Just maybe one final question that might also be an open question. We don't need the final answers, as you were mentioning, Giovannini. And I will also ask if Minister Enrico Giovannini might have a final comment. Is how necessary would you say that transformations in the so-called global financial architecture is urgent to address the complexities or the rising level of complexities and other risks that each and every one of you has mentioned at one point or another? Or is it just not the right moment to enter into that kind of discussions because governments at country level or at regional level, they have other immediate priorities? How would you weigh in the need to, I would say, systematize or enter into a deliberate approach to transform or address this question of let's address the global financial architecture? Because we can see that a lot of issues about system change are behind the door of every global approach to infrastructure systems. Who would like to briefly pick up or not on that? Robert, maybe, and then Carmine Di Noia and Giovannini.
Yeah, I think to create a new institution takes an awfully long time. Yeah. And I mean, one thing that came out of the COP last year was the countries which were there are now asking ADB, how quickly are you moving? Every time you create a new institution, you've got to hire people, get a building, sign leases, operations manual. It takes forever. Look at the experience with the Green Climate Fund. I actually think, I was in France about 2 weeks ago, and we met. Architecture is all about simplifying how we operate within the developing member countries.
Thank you. Carmine Di Noia.
In line exactly with the last point, I think, okay, there is no silver bullet, we may think extraordinary things. Let's start maybe, bottom up, and maybe a part of the global financial architecture is to better, coordinate the many different initiatives we have around. Because if you have coordination, and on the one side you have targeted, initiatives for, some projects, but also some countries with specific needs. On the other side, you may reach in this way the size and scale that you may need for, sustainable finance for infrastructure.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. Thanks.
Thank you.
I better stay away from this one.
Thank you very much. One last word, perhaps, from your side? No, that's fine. All right, so thank you very much. One round of applause for our speakers. So let's now proceed with the coffee break. On the right, at the sorry, for the people who are on site, right? On the right, out of the room, there is coffee and refreshments served, so please enjoy that. I'm kindly asking you to be back at 4:35 or half past 4, so that we can be back to the room and, and listen to the keynote of Giovannini Gorno Tempini, the president of Cassa dei Depositi. And I insist because the timing needs to be respected, and also afterwards we don't want to finish too late with the session 2, infrastructure and just energy transition mechanisms, activating private investments and building on digital opportunities. Thank you very much. So please, if I may ask all participants and speakers to come back to the room. Mr. Tempini, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes. Good evening.
Good evening to you.
Thank you very much. We have just ended the first segment of the discussion today about sustainable finance for infrastructure in light of the G20 Indonesia. And we are about to start the second segment after your keynote about the role of the private sector and digitalization. And we heard the opening remarks and statements by President Profumo, Minister Giovannini, in particular the representative of the city of Torino, and the Minister of Finance of Indonesia, Sri Indrawati Mulyani. So welcome. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining in. I know you have a very, very strict schedule and limited time. We are all the more grateful for you to join in, especially considering the role of your institution in supporting and shaping the agenda of the long-term investors, inter alia, in the G20 context, but also supporting in many ways the infrastructure agenda and other agendas during the G20 Italy last year. So, Mr. Tempini, the floor is yours with no further ado.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. President Profumo, dear Francesco, dear guest. First of all, let me thank Compagnia di San Paolo for the kind invitation to the participation, to participate to this seminar. And I am sorry that due to institutional commitments, I have not been able to participate personally in Turin. But nonetheless, I am very glad to join this conversation on sustainable infrastructure. As you have just mentioned for Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, it is very important to reinforce the support for multilateral cooperation for sustainable infrastructure financing. There is little doubt in my mind that we have to continue to work closer and deeper together in order to be successful. This is particularly crucial when looking at global trends on private investments in infrastructure. And I have to say that with a limited public fiscal space and indeed many acute needs ranging from health to social security, just to mention two important ones, but not only those, private participation in infrastructure financing has become even more important in these days. Let me spend a few words on the investment scenario related to global infrastructure. The latest data shows a mixed picture with private investment in infrastructure projects in primary markets almost back to pre-pandemic levels. That is the good news, but stagnant for 8 years running. We need to do better than that. While private investment in infrastructure projects grew by slightly more than 8% in high-income countries, in middle and low-income countries, it fell by almost 9%, meaning that 80% of projects occurred in high-income countries and only 20% in middle and low-income ones. Now, over the past decade, multilateral and development financial institutions have played a critical role focusing on the second category, middle and low-income countries. And in 2021, they were the second largest type of financier in these countries. Their participation in a project, as you know, signals its viability and creditworthiness, which helps to reduce risk and make viable more and bigger transactions to private capital. In that year, 2021, 27% of private investment in infrastructure in these countries involved a multilateral development bank as co-sponsor. They can play a key role, not only just by providing finance, but in the diffusion of sound contract design, technical advisory and assistance facilities, therefore helping counterparties set forth reliable pipelines of bankable infrastructure projects. The possible impact is high when considering that public development banks such as CDP, as highlighted at the recent Finance in Common Summit, manage a total of $23 trillion of total assets, representing roughly 12% of total global investment. This makes them crucial, therefore, in channeling resources, not only towards infrastructure, but to sustainable infrastructure so needed to address climate change and achieve SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals. This is already happening at a high pace, as the latest International Development Finance Club data highlighted the $223 billion record level of green finance mobilized by public development banks, putting many of our institutions on track to reach jointly $1.3 trillion of green finance by 2025. Let me speak for a few minutes regarding GDP initiatives towards green infrastructure. We are committed to do our part to shift financing and focus on green infrastructure financing. With our new strategic plan, we have set ambitious targets to increase impact finance and accelerate the ecological transition also in developing countries. CASA has further reinforced its commitment to sustainable development by adopting policy-driven approach with clear and consistent rules to make sustainability imperative. It is in this spirit that Cassa Depositi e Prestiti is also gradually shifting towards an operational model based on the risk-return impact framework to measure and evaluate the impact of its initiatives on people and communities' well-being. It is therefore not just an announcement. We are practically moving as an institution and as a board of the institutions to make our transition concrete and real. Projects that do not meet the necessary scores in terms of the sustainability are not going to be accepted. To deliver, Cassa Depositi e Prestiti is focusing on consolidating our partnerships with major international financial institutions and expanding high-impact direct deals and private sector investments. Cassa commitment are sustained as substantiated in projects such as the Global Green Bond initiatives promoted by the European Commission. The proposal implies the involvement of several European financial institutions to generate investments of 20 billion euros in sustainable infrastructure. We have also recently signed an agreement which provides 50 million euros in financing the Caribbean Development Bank to support construction of sustainable infrastructure and protection of natural ecosystem. More than 50% of Cassa Depositi e Prestiti portfolio today in developing countries is focused on climate finance. This number is set to rise given the newly established Italian Climate Fund, which represents Italy's main public tool to contribute to the international climate finance challenge. With an endowment of over 4 billion euros in the next 5 years, the fund will finance both public and private entities through direct and indirect finance instruments on climate mitigation and adaptation initiatives. So if cooperation is key, a few words on our international relationship. On top of unlocking financial capacity, multilateral and national promotional banks can also play a critical role in raising awareness in the dialogue with governments on the barriers that hinder the much needed investment in infrastructure. For this reason, we participate to the G7 and G20 through the G7 Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment Working Group and the D20 Development 20 Long-Term Investors Club. In the G7, we have worked to participate to the G7 commitment to invest $600 billion over the next 5 years through a joint action proposal that increases coordination between G7 development financial institutions and private investors. For investors for infrastructure in low and middle income countries, especially in Africa and Asia. Cassa intends to continue to provide its support to the G7 also in view of the Italian presidency in 2024, during which we will be able to lead the work of the G7 development finance institutions. Through the D20 Long-Term Investors Club, we have instead contributed to the G20 framework on how to best leverage private sector participation to scale up sustainable infrastructure investment and the continuation of the G20 infrastructure investors dialogue. The exchange of best practices is of paramount importance in order to ensure that our institutions move as closely as possible together. The dialogue, an event we helped the Indonesian G20 presidency organize with the OECD, has provided, in fact, G20 the unique perspective of global financial institutions on these matters. This event, which we recommend being organized on a permanent basis, was also the occasion to present the common B20, D20 long-term investors club, the T20 joint statement containing policy recommendations in support to the work of the G20 finance ministers. In the statement, we present a common call to action that prioritize green, sustainable projects that adhere to ESG criteria, enable all stakeholders to support financing the future sustainable infrastructure. We also value blended finance instruments and project preparation facilities as some of the most useful tools to increase bankable infrastructure projects. Finally, we highlight the importance of dedicated incentives and support toward digital infrastructure, as its development would create wide-ranging opportunities in education, remote work, trade, and socializing, all aspects that I'm sure we all agree are critical towards obtaining a better environment for sustainable investment. Let me conclude, therefore, saying that continuing to advocate for multilateral cooperation for sustainable infrastructure financing, GDP will continue working inside G7 and G20 working groups, the D20 Long-Term Investors Club and their partners such as B20 and T20. Only by cross-contaminating ourselves and supporting each other, we can advance the policies that enable higher and more sustainable infrastructure investments, critical drivers for economic growth with a tangible impact on social disparity, well-being, and quality of life. Thank you very much again for inviting me, and I wish you all the best for the progress of your work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We wish you an excellent afternoon, and thank you for reminding us this policy space that has largely been shaped thanks to the inputs and support from your institution, and bouncing back on what was mentioned at the opening by President Profumo about the necessity to consolidate the good acquis of each round and cycle of presidencies, be it in the G20 or in the G7, especially regarding the technical but also strategic issue of infrastructure investment and financing, and installing a permanent place where expertise, both technical and high level and strategic, that could be shared and redistributed widely, is also a rationale behind this seminar today. So thank you very much for your strong words, and hopefully for the follow-up of the conclusions that will be duly shared with you. Thank you again, and à bientôt. So thank you very much. Dear colleagues, I suggest that we now enter into the last phase of today's exploration of unlocking the power of multilateral cooperation for sustainable infrastructure financing and delivery. With the second seminar, we have two colleagues from Indonesia who are online. Danang Parikesit, the lead co-chair of the T20 Indonesia Infrastructure Task Force, and Arisya Puspo Negoro, the chief legal counsel of Indonesia Investment Authority, INA, one of the members also of the Club of Long-Term Investors. And I thank also back Rida for supporting the session today. It's very late in Indonesia, plus 6 hours, so it must be about 11 o'clock in the evening. So we will try to make the best of your night time. Also, I know that you are not sleeping much in these days. But otherwise, please join me on stage. Carla Patricia Ferrari, the Chief Financial Officer of Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo. Welcome, and thank you for hosting this. Please join me here. Thank you very much. Séverine Nervpoort, ESG Policy Advisor at Norges Bank Investment Management, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway. I think you would have appreciated the words of President Tempini. And last but not least, coming from India, Sachin Chaturvedi, the Director General of RIS, Research and Information System for Developing Countries, think tank in New Delhi, also co-chair of G20 Indonesia Infrastructure Task Force, and also last year during the G20 Italy, and member of the T20 India Steering Group, if that is the correct spelling. Thank you very much for joining in. And I see Danang is here and Aricia is here. So thank you again. It's for joining in the nighttime, right, at the Circo dei Tori in Torino. I would like, if everybody agrees, to pass it on first to our Carla Patricia Ferrari for a few, I would say, opening thoughts about the topic of our session, infrastructure and just energy transition mechanisms, activating private investment and building on digital opportunities. And then I would like to pass it on to our colleagues from Indonesia, to Séverine, and then last but not least, and please Danang and Aricia, if you don't fall asleep, stay with us till the end to share what our colleague Sachin would like to bring into the table tonight. Patricia, the floor is yours.
Yeah,
Carla.
Carla. Thank you very much, Nicholas, and good evening to all of you. It's a great pleasure for me to participate, to attend this debate, which is very rich in ideas and suggestions, especially for an institutional investor. I think that there is a lot of suggestion, very useful in order to better understand how an institutional investor has to invest in this particular asset class. But first of all, I would like to start by reminding in a few words, because Giovanni Larica has already well stressed how the economic environment has changed, but just to remind the new economic phase we are living in. For 30 years at least, we have lived in a very low real interest rate environment, and till up to 2021 with very low inflation. Now, since the end of 2021, the situation has dramatically changed, and now we have high inflation, and inflation is dampening both spending and the production throughout the economy. In addition to that, we have also very strong geopolitical tensions, which are impacting very negatively on confidence of both consumers and businesses. So now what is certain that uncertainty is very high. And in this new context, an institutional investor is not very comfortable with, let's say. But we have to understand, as Giovanni Larica explained very well, that the global economy is facing a dark and gloomy outlook scenario because for these reasons, high inflation, high uncertainty. And on the other hand, we have to take into account that the euro area economy, where skyrocketing gas and energy prices have impacted very negatively, is experiencing a strong slowdown, substantial slowdown in the economic growth, especially if compared with what was expected for 2022 after the pandemic crisis, because we expected for our euro area an important growth rate after this crisis. So we are working as institutional investor in this context, and we have to face all these challenges. But I think that infrastructure investment represent for institutional investors an important opportunity, because it's crucial for them to start again to invest in the real economy. And infrastructure investment belong to this asset class, and they are able to enhance the development of an area by supporting also a sustainable growth of that area. I have some figures, but they are not so important because the infrastructure gap that has been mentioned is so big that when we know that investment in these areas, in this asset class, exceeded $1 trillion, it was dollar in 2021, and the good news that they exceed they double to $2 trillion by 2026 in 5 years. So it seems to be a very important result, but indeed it isn't, because we have so important need of financing of that. In this situation, I think that infrastructure investment, in any way, for a certain reason that I will try to explain, looks set to become more and more attractive for institutional investors. Among them, there are not only foundations, like such as Compagnia San Paolo, but also pension funds, endowment, insurance companies. And for all these institutional investors, they manage around 32% of the total financial asset worldwide. So they are very important players in the financial scenario. For those investors, it's important to have the opportunity to invest in infrastructure. Why? There are different factors. First of all, I mentioned the pension funds and insurance companies. For them, it's very important because infrastructure investment represent a sort of natural fit with their long duration liabilities. Then infrastructure investments are able to deliver predictable, stable, long-term cash flows, and this is also very important not only for certain institutional investors like pension funds and insurance companies, but also for a foundation. It's quite important to have this stability in financial resources. Then also to mention the fact that infrastructure investments present lower sensitivity to the swings of business cycles compared to other asset classes, equity and also bonds for certain aspects. This means that infrastructure assets that are less exposed to short-term market volatility. And it doesn't mean that they are totally immune from a market downturn, but that there is a good evidence that they present a sort of downside protection. So they are more resilient as investments, more resilient to the market downturn. So these are a lot of good reasons for an institutional investor to invest in such asset class. But now I point out a more important one, inflation. So there is a link between inflation and infrastructure real assets. And in some cases, I mean, when we talk about infrastructure projects, I mean, they are not always the same asset class. There are the sort of differences among these asset class. But in most cases, infrastructure projects represent a natural hedge against inflation, a protection against inflation, because the revenues of investment in infrastructure projects are protected contractually, because they are based on, because they invested in regulated assets or are based on long-term concessions. An example, if a regulated asset like electricity distribution, or if in a scheme of the PPP model, a public service, an essential service is delivered by the private sector. This is typically of concession, and in this case, contracts are quite supporting and they are defending against inflation. What does it mean? This means that these projects have a certain pricing power, that is to say the capacity to pass through cost increases to the end user or consumer. And in some cases it happens, and it's very important to have this kind of protection against inflation. And in this phase is very, very important. In the end, as Chief Financial Officer, I remember that one other important aspect of this asset class is represented by the fact that it is very important for the diversification portfolio policy, because it's a good diversifier for the simple reason we have just explained, that it's not the correlation with other asset class in the market is quite low, and for this reason it's very good to have a sort of balance in our portfolio and to have this kind of diversifier. So I give you some reasons to understand why, even if we are starting slowly, and for example, as far as Compagnia is concerned, I know that the infrastructure, real asset, but infrastructure, mainly infrastructure investment, represents a total 3% as commitments, total 3% of total. 3% of total portfolio as commitments. So it's not enormous, but it's a starting point. It's quite important, and we already did this investment in the past, and now we think that we have to discuss about what we will do in the future concerning this asset class. I think that it's important to also stress that infrastructure has a very strict link with the two transitions we mentioned in order to enhance a sustainable development. That is to say, the digital and environmental transition. Infrastructure indeed are, I think, the least technological impacted sector, because we have there is a lot to do from a digital point of view to improve the infrastructure, as it has been already stressed in this debate. But there is a sort of correlation among them. For example, during the pandemic, it was quite evident that where there were important infrastructure, efficient infrastructure, both from a physical and digital point of view, there services, both digital or essential services like healthcare, hospitals, for example, were also derived. So infrastructure can condition the delivery of good services in this sector, but at the same time, good infrastructure can enhance the digital and environmental transition. So this capacity to enable digital innovation, to generate good impact, give to this asset class an important role also for governments. This means that it's an impactful tool for governments to reach a more resilient, a more sustainable, and a more inclusive future. This is another reason, alongside the financial performances for an institutional investor, this is another good reason to invest in this asset class. So, what Compagnia San Paolo does from this point of view? I have still time or no?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, 2 minutes. Kemenkeu São Paulo has managed as an important portfolio, 7 billion today, 7 billion euros, and invested both in listed equities and fixed income, but also important part is invested in private markets, among them infrastructure, real estate, private equity and venture capital. And in investing in infrastructure, we decided 1 year ago to allocate an important single ticket in a fund dedicated to investing in infrastructure, the Equity Infrastructure Innovation and Impact Fund, launched by the SGR Ercel, and where Equita, which is a subsidiary owned also by Kemenkeu São Paulo, works to select and to structure financially the project in which we wanted to invest. It's a mid-market project, and especially what is very important in this fund, and we think to use the impact model concerning the intentionality, measurability, and additionality of these investments. Afterwards, if I have time, I'll give some more information on this fund.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you very much. And this enabling capacity, right, of infrastructure on a macroeconomic level, but also on a governance level, also echoes what Robert Schollhammer just mentioned before about the catalytic effect of investments by MDBs, right? So this is rather encouraging and a message of optimism, right, after the insights by Chairman Tempini, tempering a little bit, right, the piling up of challenges and difficulties that we have seen in the previous part of the discussion, and we can back to those elements, of course, in a second. I would like to pass it on to Danang Parikesit now, if you are with us again, the lead co-chair of the T20 Indonesia, about some main takeaways of the T20. And I know there is especially one point, there are many, but one point about supporting a better way to fund urban infrastructure projects that are also equitable and inclusive. Maybe you can let us know if this has advanced after the meeting that you have set up to convince Minister Mulyani and others that this should be part of the main G20 conclusions. Danang, the floor is yours, and then we will pass it on to Arisya Pusponegoro from the Indonesia Investment Authority. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicholas. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Please go on.
Okay, good, great. So have a good day, everybody. It's 11:15 here. PM is my bedtime, actually. So, but I'll try to stay awake, and because I see so many prominent figures in the audience as well. So thanks, Nicholas, for inviting me to this important webinar. Also to Professor Profumo, who is also the co-chair of the T20. Let me just I should also thank Ms. Kala for giving much of the theoretical foundation of the needs to sustaining investments and finance and infrastructure. So it saves a lot of my time giving the backgrounds of why we are doing this. So thanks once again. Let me just give you some background on the T20 journey and how we can contribute, or we will contribute to the G20, and this month, mid of this month in Bali, Indonesia. Can you show us the first slide, please? Yes, this is two documents that we think is particularly important for the G20. The first one is the Task Force Policy Notes, which is basically recollections of what we have done within the Task Force 8 on infrastructure investment and finance. Nicolas and Sachin are both from the co-chairs of that task force. So I think Professor Profumo is also in that task force. So we have good numbers of experts and practitioners sitting in that task force, and we have been able to invite quite a number of policy briefs to come up with the policy notes and recommendations. We have within the T20 there are several task forces. It has produced T20 communique is also downloadable from our websites. But basically what we have done is to gather all the ideas and innovative ideas from all over the world and across different regions and disciplines to put together a solid recommendation to be presented to the G20. And I think I just listened to earlier on Ministry of Finance Sri Mulyani's speech on the dynamics and the global economic situation. I think it's pretty much the discussion so far in the last couple of months, 8 months, to come up with the well, it's not saying that we are not pretty sure about what's going to happen in 2023, but I think from our perspective, I think we need to be very cautious, very careful, and very aware about the risk associated with the uncertainties going forward in 2023. Can you show us the second? I will not speak for long, Nicolas. Just want to highlight some of the findings and recommendation from our task force. Can you help me, please, the second slide?
Yeah.
Right. So there are policy drivers and there are policy recommendations. I think it's very important for us to understand once again, that for a couple of times now that the Minister of Finance of the government of Indonesia and Indonesia presidency has already endorsed basically the so-called framework for sustainability and investment and finance. So SIF has been more or less adopted as a framework for the G20, and I think it's basically what we need to do is to move from that frameworks to do some things on the infrastructure developments. Secondly, I think it's also very important that this global dynamics is increasing the risk of investments, both for the public sector investments. Earlier, I listened also to the colleagues from the Asian Development Banks that is pretty concerned about the government spending as well, public sector spending. It is more important now that people are relying more on public-private partnership for different reasons. One reason is because the belief that the private sector could deliver innovations better to the infrastructure technology. But the other reason is because the government lack of capacity to invest and to fulfill the demand for infrastructure. Already I remember back many months ago, Nicolas, when we have a GSI meeting in Berlin, that even Jeffrey Sachs already mentioned at that time that the global geopolitical conflict has already a big threat to the ongoing achievement of SDG, and he's pretty worried and pretty sure that the SDG will not be able to be fulfilled by the existing financial finance from all over the world. And it is again worsened by the geopolitical conflicts between Russia and Ukraine. So it is reiterating what Sri Mulyani mentioned earlier about the bigger risks and bigger uncertainty going forward. Again, going back to the slides, please. We also echo the needs for a bigger role for the multilateral development banks. Although colleagues from ADB mentioned that it's so tiny in terms of the size of the investment compared to the availability of funds, but we think it is also very important that we are asking more for MDGs to de-risk the projects and all the long-term financial investors to also go hand by hand and de-risking the projects. We also have a very specific discussion about the urban projects and urban development projects, because urban projects and city level projects are often not pretty much putting into attentions to the G20 leaders because the national governments think that is the role of the local governments, and the international financing institutions thinks only on the nationwide projects. So I think we come up with two very specific proposals. One is to extend the SIF, the Sustainable Investment in Finance, into a sustainable infrastructure investment in finance frameworks, which needs to be pushed, endorsed and pushed forward by the G20 and put that into practice. The second proposal that we come up with, and we would like to look more specific, to walk the talk, to put that into implementations, is the ideas of establishing a global investment platform for sustainable urban development or urban projects. We think that this helps the city governments, and it's also echoed by the U20 very strongly to put more focus on urban projects. And I think it also should be highlighted that what we mean by sustainable, it should also be embedded inside is the innovation and innovative solutions to the project. So I think I will stop there, Nicholas. I hope that this policy driver recommendation could be pushed forward. We still have 2 weeks more to influence all the policymakers and the G20 leaders. So thanks again, and have a fruitful discussion later on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I understand also you are keen, even after the Indonesian G20 presidency, to continue sharing the expertise and build on the expertise that was built, right, during this round of T20, and that will be absolutely critically important, and also echoing what Francesco Profumo mentioned in the very beginning. Thank you again, Danang, for those very precise elements. From the point of view of the D20, Arisha, please share any insights that you would like to put in the spotlight. I know you have also presentations, but feel free to use the presentations as background material. Most important is that we can hear from the perspective of your institution, who has been so proactive also to both support the T20, but support an innovative way to envision such issues as de-risking infrastructure investments, but also promote multi-stakeholder engagement, blended finance, and so on. The floor is yours, and thank you again for joining us that late at your time.
Thank you very much, Nicola. A very good afternoon, your time, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be here, and of course, it's also an honor for INA, the Indonesian Investment Authority, to be able to share our experience in connection with the Energy Transition Mechanism program, or what we call as an ETM program, which is in line with what we have been discussing throughout this conference, is about sustainable development, and also leveraging the cooperation between the business sectors, the private sectors, and also the government support and incentives necessary to enable the development of sustainable energy in this case. Perhaps it would be helpful if I provide a quick introduction to INA before I start the presentation. So INA, as you can see in my profile picture, stands for the Indonesian Investment Authority. We are the Indonesian Sovereign Wealth Fund. We were established in November 2020, so just short of 2 years. We are quite young compared to other sovereign wealth funds in the world. In terms of our structure, both governance structure and organization structure, we have a two-tier board. So we have the Board of Supervisors, in which the Minister of Finance, Mrs. Sri Mulyani, who just gave the opening speech this morning, and also the Minister of SOE and 3 other professionals. The second tier is also, of course, the Board of Directors, which comprise entirely of professionals of different backgrounds. Currently, we have key sector focus, what we call as the 4 pillars. One is infrastructure. So that covers, for example, toll roads, airports, ports. And then second pillar, we have healthcare, which covers hospital and pharmacy, among others. For the third pillar, we have digital transformation, just covering everything from the telco towers to e-commerce, peer-to-peer lending, etc. The fourth one, which is relevant to our discussion today, is energy, which is basically our ETM program, renewable energy, and also other development for the sustainability supply of energy for the people of Indonesia. We are also looking into projects for opportunity, quite opportunistically, in addition to the 4 pillars. For example, if some investments are complementary or could support our other investors, we are also going to look into that. So with that, now we go, that could provide a nice segue into the first slide that I'm going to present today, which is actually our ETM program. So to provide a little bit of context of why this ETM program is important and critical for Indonesia, first of all, if you look at the data from the Global Energy Monitor, so 90% of the coal-fired power plants of the world, which is around 190, are located in Asia, primarily in developing countries such as India and of course in Indonesia as well, and also in China. And if you look to Indonesia specifically, based on the data from PLN, which is our state utility company, the installed capacity of Indonesia is around 63 gigawatts, out of which 60% is still coal-fired power plant. And out of that 60%, probably around 30% is by IPP, or independent power producers, or the private sectors, with the remaining is by PLN, the state utility company. Indonesia is also a net coal exporter. Coal is also still very cheap compared to other fuel generation for power plants. And in terms of the development of the electricity sector itself, it's still very much a growing sector, mainly fueled by, of course, the growing economy of Indonesia, and also the support of the government in order to provide accessible and reliable electricity to the masses. And it is still a very high, relatively high investor interest to invest in the electricity sector. So if you look into that, and then you look also to Indonesia commitment, for example, we have a commitment to basically reduce green gas emission by 29% to 41% by 2030, and to reach net zero carbon by 2060. So if you look, in one hand, we have a majority of our power plant, which is fueled by coal, and then on the other hand, we have this commitment to fulfill. We would need to have some innovative but also economically acceptable program to be able to reach that net zero carbon target by 2060. So that's where our ETM program comes in. So our ETM program is basically a program for early retirement of power plants, in which we will refinance power plants and then replace that with renewable energy source. If you would go please to the first slide.
Aricia?
Yes.
Yes. Just at this time, a quick question about also, and we can get back to the specificities of the ETM, and of course the material. If you agree, the material from your presentation, we would like to keep it and to be able to share it with the participants and speakers, because it's very rich and accurate material on a major topic that was also described or presented by your Minister of Finance during an opening statements. But just a quick question for you in this moment. So your institution, you said it was not established a long time ago, right? But you have been part of so many meetings with so many different counterparts during the cycle of the G20 Indonesia, which is not over yet, right? What would be the main lesson or the main benefit from INA to have been part of meetings with the T20, with the B20, with governments, with others? How do you view, when you look back on the past months, the benefits of engaging really hands-on in this G20 complex series of negotiations and working cycles?
I think, for one, as you point out, we are quite young in terms of the organization itself, right? So it is also an opportunity for us to introduce ourselves to the market and introduce our program, what we are all about. That's one. The second one is also an opportunity to connect and to have access to various different type of investors and also financial, which may not previously have access, or probably they do have access, but not really a knowledge of Indonesia when they want to invest into Indonesia. So it works both ways as well. So for us, it's an opportunity to introduce the program to the market and engage the interest as well from the different investors and financial. And on the other hand, for the investor and financial, it's also an opportunity to know the Indonesian market better, to have a knowledge and understanding, for example, on the regulatory context, on what are the government support and what are the initiatives that could go in hand with any of the programs that the financial or the investors are looking into investing. Apologies before I forgot, I'm actually here also joined by Mr. Andri Setiawan, which is our Managing Director of Investment, who is leading the ETM program for INA and also various investment initiatives. And he could also answer some of the questions if required.
Thank you very much. And I must also mention that the chairperson of Indonesia Investment Authority, Pak Rida Virakusuma, right, is also, if I'm not mistaken, the lead co-chair of the infrastructure task force in the B20, the group of business, right? So this is also a way to further build bridges and also continuing on what you mentioned in your opening statement. And we can see that in these kinds of policy environments, the mood is changing from the word is piling up of constraints into it is possible to invest, right? So thank you very much, Aricia. Please stay with us if you wish, otherwise you are more than excused. But I would, and that might also be of some interest for you, pass it on to Séverine Nervport, the ESG policy advisor at the Sovereign Wealth Funds of Norway, which is not so new now, and which has a portfolio which has grown significantly over the years, and is one of the more prominent stakeholders in that field. In this time when we are at the G20 summit and the COP27 is about to start, etc., we have heard many times the issue of responsible investment coming in, the issue of ESG, which is exactly what you're working on. But maybe before that, how would you react to what was mentioned by a younger fund, or if there is anything you would like to pick up from this discussion or from the previous insights? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Good afternoon, everyone. I feel very privileged to be here today in Torino, which is a city very close to my heart, and with such esteemed panelists. To react, there are so many things we learned today, so many interesting things were said, and I want to react to what Carla said earlier, which is, why would institutional investors want to invest in infrastructure? And that's the question that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund asked themselves relatively recently with the government of Norway, because we added this asset class only in 2020. So although the fund has been established in the 90s, to use the oil revenues of Norway and invest for future generations of Norwegians, this is a new asset class for us. So the fund overall is $1 trillion euro under management, and 70% is invested in equities, listed equities. We also invest in fixed income, in unlisted real estate, and now in infrastructure for renewable energy since 2020. And we made our first investment in 2021. It's a wind farm off the coast of the Netherlands. And the executive board of the fund has decided to invest in solar and wind in Europe and North America. So a relatively conservative approach. That's the choice that has been made. So how do we approach responsible investment? So that's a big question. We approach it as a financial investor. That's how we think about it. We think that the way companies manage sustainability risk, but also opportunities, can really have a big impact on their ability to create value in the long term. But also because we're a universal investor, basically invested in the whole economy globally, we are dependent on sustainable development. So if if a company pollutes a river, even if they make money out of polluting the river, it's going to impact other companies in the portfolio. So that's why we care about these things, basically, from a financial perspective. And we approach this at 3 levels. First of all, at market level, so we seek to influence standards, norms, rules to make sure that, for instance, we have better sustainability reporting, we finance research. Then at portfolio level, by integrating ESG consideration into investment decision and risk management considerations. And then at company level, by engaging with companies, voting at shareholder meetings, and setting clear expectation of companies on ESG. In infrastructure investment, of course, it's different, so we had to think about that, but we really wanted to integrate ESG consideration as part of the technical due diligence from a risk perspective to really assess the value of the investment. I can come back to that. And then once we invest in the asset, we want company to report on how they impact the environment and society, and we take that into account. I thought I would say a word about climate change, just because it's one of the biggest existential questions of our time. And we saw last week the report published by the UN that says that the planet is very near a catastrophic situation, and time is running very, very fast. That was my personal input, not the Norwegian Fund's view. But the Norwegian Fund has published 2 weeks ago a climate action plan where we say how we intend to manage climate risk for the fund. And for us, the main tool is really the ownership, active ownership, how we can engage the companies we invest in. We're invested in 9,000 companies globally. And for half of these companies, we are one of their top 10 shareholders. So we tend to well, they listen to what we say. And so a big part is really pushing companies to set net zero commitment by 2050, to show us their transition plan and how they intend to get there. But of course, you know, to meet for the global community to meet the Paris Agreement and the commitments that were made, investing in infrastructure is a key part of that. So at our level, although it's only 2% of the fund, so quite comparable, a big fund, but same percentage, we see investing in renewable energy infrastructure as a big part we can play to the transition to a low carbon economy. Maybe I can stop there.
Thank you. It's fascinating to see this experience rolling on. And now I'm turning to our dear colleague, Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi. Same question as we are reaching out at the end of today's insights, and we have heard a lot. Maybe 2 points. First, is there anything you would like to pick up from the discussions so far, from the proposals, from the insights, from this exploration of the global macroeconomic and governance landscapes and policy landscape of our discussion? And the second point, as you are heavily thinking, intensively thinking about how to articulate the emerging priorities of both the G20 India, I know your institute has been committed to support a number of ministers and working groups, but also your engagement in shaping the T20. If there are any points you would like to raise at this moment, and thank you again for joining in person for the discussion. It's very, very highly appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Nicola, for giving this opportunity and for having this connect here. I think the first point that I would like to very much pick up from the previous session, which Gianni made more in terms of the macro perspective, and Carla also emphasized. We also heard a similar point by Minister Indravati this afternoon, is in terms of the way global economy is going. And I think Carla is absolutely right that we require resources for investment and infrastructure. That point is absolutely clear. What has emerged very clearly now is in terms of who would be actually contributing to accelerating the recession. And we are seeing the way US economy is going. The criticism that we had heard earlier was that emerging markets would bring down the economy. And reverse is coming up. Reverse is in terms of what we are saying as global recession is actually confined to US and parts of Europe. The emerging economies are ahead. And this, I think, requires further traction for consolidation. The bright markets of the world economy, they need to consolidate. And this consolidation would come in terms of how we are going to take forward investment in those sectors which are going to recycle liquidity, bring down the huge inflations and the obsession that global economy has shown with inflation targeting is something where national choices in terms of selection, both in terms of quantitative easing and also in terms of how we bring in balance with employment generation, infrastructure investment and liquidity. All the three we balance. Interest rates, obviously everyone has to enter in. But this Volcker era of focusing on interest rate as an instrument to control inflation, I think we need to reconsider. Countries that have tried this endogeneity within their process of decision making have asserted and have prevailed. We are seeing that the developed countries, particularly led by the US, are showing the deceleration that we are seeing in the economy. Having said that, we now need to look into 3 or 4 broad dimensions, which I think we heard very well from Mr. Francisco in terms of how we look at that consolidation. And that consolidation, in my view, has emerged very well. Just 3 broad points, Nicola, I would like to make. The first and foremost is when Indian presidency for G20 comes in, I think the effort has to be made in terms of the convergence of green, climate-friendly and development finance. How do we bring in that? How do we do away with the fragmentation and the various instrumentalities that have emerged for financing of specific activities? So far, with the decline of the ODA, so the grant point which came up in the previous session, I think the grant element, the credit creation, the global debt crisis was mentioned. How do we overcome those fragmentations that are there and we consolidate? So the first and foremost point that we are looking at is in terms of bringing in a consensus in terms of consolidation of the finance, both development, green, and also in any other category that they are in. So that consolidation, I think, is important. The second part which is important is in terms of the governance of it. And governance has, in my view, 5 elements, part of which in the previous session you did ask other panelists and they did answer. First and foremost is institution. We already heard the idea that came up in terms of financing of the urban infrastructure which Danang mentioned. So I think it is a great recommendation by the Indonesian T20 and G20 presidency. If that comes up in the G20 declaration, in my view, that would be moving in that direction. So what institution we need? Perfectly important point. And we need to see if a global group where today you have tried to bring B20, T20, D20 together, I think that's an excellent way to go forward in terms of creating a global institutional architecture. So that's one. Second, what definition? Sometimes you have different definitions of green finance, etc., which attract different rates of interest, and as a result, access to credit and also ability to generate credit is becoming a major issue. So what definition? Third is what data? So that data collection, I think, is an important dimension, particularly on ESG, and how do we bring that in what way we classify. And then, of course, the point that we heard from Mr. Tempini in terms of the bond markets, the impact bonds. So the new and innovative sources of financing that are going to go forward. So the first point about governance that I mentioned. The second is about the idea of energy and digital transition when we talk of. I would not get into too many details, but definitely on energy, the quantums that we are getting from the MDBs, the GFIs and development banks, some sort of consolidation there is required. Recapitalization of MDBs we have already discussed in the Indonesian presidency. That's one of the agenda items. But given the recessionary trend, as Carla mentioned, this again would be one important challenge for us to go forward. But then among the emerging economies, the idea of a regional grid, like for instance, India has just now launched the South Asia group on energy, SAGE, which is establishing a regional grid. The European Investment Bank, the USAID, They are connecting both Southeast Asia, so Myanmar, Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, India, and Bangladesh. They are forming a regional grid. So some of these initiatives where infrastructure investment is already going in, AIIB and others are pitching in. So that I think is something which can go forward. The G7 has already announced PGII, and this is something which is important in terms of how by 2027 we would bring in the $600 billion that are needed. If these kind of projects where returns are high, inflation is not that great, and possibility of having returns is important. This is also true for digital dimension. So in Indian G20 presidency, we are trying to identify 3 very clearly defined pillars. One, on urban infrastructure financing. Second, the definition part of convergence of development finance and others, bringing in all the governance related issues. And third, which is important, is in terms of this energy transition. So these are, Nicola, some of the points which I have in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, if there is no other remark from...
Do you want to remark?
Of course, always.
The only thing I wanted to add, listening to the other intervention, is that don't forget that the period of economic slowdown or even a recession represent the best period to invest. Obviously, you have to be able to select, otherwise it's very good. So it's not the economic growth is not the best period. The period of economic growth is not the best period to invest. But when there is a recession or an economic downturn, probably you can find good opportunities.
Point duly noted, and we will be shared also with our colleague from the Indonesian Ministry of Finance, who will do a series of closing remarks tomorrow at the end of our second day session. With this, I would like to propose closing this excellent panel discussion. Thank you so much, Sachin, Severin, and Carla. Yes, thank you very much. And before everyone is free to go, I think we have one last message, if I'm not mistaken, from the director of the fiscal agency, Fabio Casaribu. But I'm asking in terms of household rules, if since it is being recorded message, we can also use it maybe tomorrow to restart our discussion. I don't know if it is too late now, if we want to wrap up the discussion. It's up to us to decide collectively about the best way to proceed. What do you think? Maybe Valeria? We will show the video now. All right. So let's show, please, the video now, and then conclude the discussion. And I think there is a dinner afterwards at some point. Please, Valeria, maybe give us some more detailed information. Please, last segment of today's journey.
His Excellency, Mr. Enrico Giovannini, former Minister of Infrastructure of Italy, Mr. Francesco Profumo, President of Fondazione Campania and co-chair of T20 Infrastructure Task Force, Mr. Alberto Cirio, President of Piedmont Region, Michaela Favaro, Deputy Mayor, City of Turin, prominent speakers, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. I would like to begin my closing remarks by appreciating honorable guests, prominent speakers, and participants for joining today's hybrid webinar on the third seminar on sustainable infrastructure finance, with the main theme of unlocking the power of multilateral corporate cooperation for sustainable infrastructure financing and delivery. The seminar series is a joint initiative that gathers the T20, D20, and B20 together with the Indonesian Ministry of Finance and the G20 Finance Track. The topics and agendas that have been set up in the seminar series are brought up to ensure an accelerated, inclusive, and safe global recovery globally, as well as to sustain a more sustainable future for global development. Therefore, this seminar provides a solid platform for key public and private players, MDBs and IOs of the global sustainable finance to unlocking the power of multilateral cooperation for sustainable infrastructure financing under cooperation agenda of G20, together with T20, D20, and B20. This seminar also finds its relevance for strengthening infrastructure investment seen ahead of the G20 Leaders Summit. Prominent speakers, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, infrastructure is an essential enabling factor to accelerate growth. Infrastructure is also the backbone of the global economy, where it represents a powerful leverage of transformation, navigating economic and social development, including sustainable environmental and development of urbanization. However, the infrastructure landscape is rapidly changing as the unprecedented effects of the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic add pressures and complexity to our ability to deliver the infrastructure target of 2050. While efforts to overcome the pandemic remain critical in this current juncture, the collective initiative to increase infrastructure investment is also critically important to address the scarring effects, to enhance long-term growth potential, as well as to support transition toward a greener economy, particularly in achieving carbon emission reduction targets. It is estimated that around $6.3 trillion of infrastructure investment each year is needed to meet 2030 development goals, and even increase to $6.9 trillion a year to achieve the Paris Agreement target. Indonesia considers infrastructure as one of the key elements in promoting structural reforms to sustain our future economic development. We will continue to intensify reforms in various critical areas, including driving human capital quality, accelerating infrastructure, boosting digitalization, and strengthening cooperation bilaterally, regionally, including multilaterally, as in the forum of the G20. The infrastructure development is delivered not only to help close the infrastructure gap, but also to contribute to broad goals on promoting sustainable growth and development, generating economic efficiency, and meeting sustainable development targets by considering environmental, resilience, inclusion, and good governance elements. Therefore, we need indicators to make sure the quality of the infrastructure investment. Considering the significant role of infrastructure development in the achievement of global ambition, the G20 Finance Track has a strong commitment to support a sustainable structure and ensure the long-term G20 infrastructure agenda could be well delivered. The G20 presidency of Indonesia has set the tone and emphasized the role of sustainable finance, building on the outcomes of the G20 presidency of Italy back in 2021. In this context, the Indonesian presidency has set 4 priority agendas of infrastructure, namely, the first, developing a framework on how to best leverage private sector participation to scale up sustainable infrastructure investment. Secondly, developing a policy toolkit to mobilize innovative infrastructure financing mechanisms in regions and cities to address the higher risk of discrepancies among regions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Third, exploring options to enable more cost-efficient, better quality digital infrastructure and use of infratech. Last, advancing the InfraTracker 2.0 tool to provide insights into long-term infrastructure strategies, plans, and policies to achieve transformative outcomes. We believe that sustainable finance agenda plays an important role in achieving our overarching theme of the G20 under Indonesian presidency. to recover together and recover stronger. In this regard, we are pleased that finance ministers and central bank governors in their series of meetings have provided strategic guidance in developing the sustainable finance deliverables with one of the priority areas of infrastructure. In the last G20 FMCBG meeting in October 2022, finance ministers and central bank governors have discussed ways to revitalize infrastructure investment in a sustainable, inclusive, accessible, and affordable way to ensure a stronger recovery. These include, among others, endorsement of the voluntary and non-binding G20 GI Hub framework on how to best leverage private sector participation to scale up sustainable infrastructure investment, which will consider country circumstances and which will complement investment from other sources, including public investment and finance provided by MDBs, endorsement of G20 OECD policy toolkit on mobilizing funding and financing for inclusive and quality infrastructure investment in regions and cities, which is prepared with the support of the Asian Development Bank. Endorsement of the Infra Tracker 2.0 to enable both the public and private sectors toward transformative infrastructure investment post-COVID-19, and the G20 compendium of case studies on digital infrastructure finance. Closing my remark, I would like to reiterate that Indonesia has a strong concern to achieve tangible outputs of the presidency priority agenda, including infrastructure and sustainable finance. Closing the infrastructure gap is a collective effort. The governments need to promote the development of quality and sustainable infrastructure, while at the same time requires sustainable finance. In this regard, multilateral development banks, MDBs, could leverage tools such as credit enhancements to create risk-adjusted investment opportunities, and the private sector to prioritize investments that adhere to environmental and social best practices. The combination of those three components will be very important to implement the sustainable and inclusive infrastructure. We are pleased to witness that throughout 2022, the T20, D20, and B20 have met and deepened their collaboration to explore new policy solutions to de-risk infrastructure investments and overcome the current systemic infrastructure finance gap gridlock. Within the context of G20, this collaboration will also send a clear message to the international community that G20 is working to address important issues faced by both developed and developing countries. Together, we can make the world better. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that and the last segment of insights shared by the G20 Indonesia, I would like to thank Maurizio Marone, the Counselor for International Decentralized Cooperation of Piedmont Region, to say a few, maybe not concluding words, but maybe a few words about how international your region is. And I think I will not summarize now a very, very rich day of insights and exchanges, but I can only say one thing. Under the control of our host, Compagnia di San Paolo, here in the Circolo dei Lettori, that definitely there is room for Torino and the region to become one hotbed of, I would say, shared infrastructure and sustainable infrastructure investment intelligence and cooperation across the G20, across so many different perspectives, but also the G7, and that this has been, I think, largely witnessed by the speakers and participants who have also raised an impressive quantity of ongoing challenges, but also solutions to address them. So thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours for a few words, please.
First of all, I want to carry regards of President of Region Piemonte, Alberto Cirio, to all of you, and thank especially Francesco Profumo and Compagnia di San Paolo for hosting such important and interesting seminar here in Turin. Our territory is really open-eyed about need to obtain as soon as possible sustainable infrastructures able to improve economic development, facing at the same time pollution and its consequences on climate and people's health. Piemonte is waiting by 20 years high-speed railway from Lyon to Turin, and we really hope to finally complete it to enforce a connection of Italian logistics with Europe and move goods through Padan Plain in eco-sustainable way. COVID pandemic and needs of companies about smart working showed also heavy limits on internet connection, still current in some areas of our territory. Therefore, bringing fiber everywhere is strategic and pressing. This seminar is arranging, I think, works for most epochal G20 ever. Whole world is looking at upcoming G20 in Indonesia with hope of bilateral meetings able to open the way for peace and start global de-escalation. Actually, we read, unfortunately, on international newspapers about civil infrastructures only as military targets. Bridges, pipelines, airports, harbors should always connect peoples and be preserved by destruction of war. With this humble message, Region Piemonte thanks all of you for such marvelous event, wishing to host you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this acknowledgement. And with this, I suggest to wrap up the first day of our discussion. A few household elements. Dinner will be served at 8 p.m. in here. That is in the next room, precisely. Hosted by Compagnia di San Paolo. Thank you very much. Tomorrow, it will be a bit different. We will still convene here. It will not be a public open discussion as today, so we can get into a number of specific issues. The discussion will start at 10. Please convene at 9:30 for coffee until noon. We will have a few overall concluding remarks from the Director for Regional and Bilateral Policy at the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia, Nela Andrietti, who has been very, very helpful indeed into connecting the dots and ensuring that both her Director and Minister Mulyani could join effectively. And I cannot thank her enough in this moment. And then we will have a final time of lunchtime. So thank you again, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Thank you.